Hi, my name is Lily Guerra, and so this is a case study I did last fall for one of my um, English classes, teaching methods for English. And so first, I'm going to start off by explaining what is reading comprehension. And so it's the purpose of reading. It's not the product, but the whole process of how one reads. So what does it entail? It's how one makes sense of the text while reading it, and it begins before the child opens the book. So I'm going to ask you guys some questions, and you guys can raise your hand, or if you guys just want to say out loud yes or no, that's totally fine with me too. So, do you think that a child uses their background knowledge of the world like they're understanding when they're reading? Yes or no? Yes, thank you. Do you think they're using their personal experiences as they read? Yeah. Do you think they're also using their background knowledge, like things they've learned in school during the day? Yes. What about visual information? This can be the picture or the way the word actually looks onto the page. Do you think they're using that as they read? Yes. What about their previous literacy experience, like when a teacher has read to them or their parents? Do you think that also plays into the reading process? Yes, it does. So here's a really trick question. If a child can read fluently, can they comprehend what they're reading? Yes or no? Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise your hand if you say no. Those who said yes, can you raise your hand and tell me why you think they can read, they can comprehend? Dr. Lotto?
Because I'm assuming if they're reading fluently, they have the right intonation. So if you are using the right intonation, it means you are understanding what they were trying to write on the page.
So we would think that because the student, when we hear them read orally, that they are comprehending, but think of it as vocabulary. When you learn vocabulary, you learn how to spell it, correct? And we also learn the meaning, but the true test is when we use the vocabulary in our everyday language, right? So just because a student can read it on the page doesn't necessarily mean that when they step away from the text that they're going to be able to process what they just read. And so this is where early intervention really plays a big key role. And so after the first 3 years of schooling, there is some 20% of students who still struggle in reading. These students often continue to struggle and may never catch up to their peers. My study shows that within the various skills taught in reading, it is important to provide a struggling student with direct intervention in the areas which they are weak. So it's important that we focus on comprehension as a whole because it's a lifetime skill that students are going to carry with them throughout their whole life. Like, if they're comprehending the story they're going to read right now, later years down the road, they're going to use these same skills when they're in college, reading their textbooks and analyzing higher English literature. And so my case study, I did it on a 4th grade student, and 4th grade is a very significant year because there's a very big transition that happens during reading. Can anyone guess what the big transition might be? Well, it's when in the earlier years there's a big focus where we're teaching students how to read, right? We're teaching them what letters make what sounds, and our big focus is on that. We want to get them to catch up. But then after 4th grade, there's a big shift in where we now want the students to read to learn. So in a lot of this, you'll see with nonfiction books and their textbooks, we want them to read and we want them to learn from what they're reading. And so nonfiction textbooks are incorporated a lot earlier in the younger years because we don't want the students to be so shocked when that's all they start to begin to read in the class. And so my case study, I did it on Noah. He's a male in 4th grade that attends school in Fairfax County. My case study took place over several weeks, and I would meet with him for short intervals after school in a very informal setting. And so my task during my case study was to find out what my students' strengths and weaknesses were. Why do you think it's important to find what a student's strengths and weaknesses are? Anyone want to raise their hand? Yes.
To find out where you're going to start.
Yes, that's true. We want to know where we can help our students, where we can close the gap for our students. We want to make sure that they can succeed. And so that's why as a teacher, you have to collect a lot of data, both informally and formally, to kind of see where your student is. Typically, you'll do a lot more assessments at the beginning of the school year to really get to know who your student is. And so I did 5 different types. I did a reading interest survey, developmental spelling assessment, a time word writing, a running record, and writing samples. And I did several of each of them. And I will show you. Okay, so my time word writing was I had my student sit down and I gave him a blank piece of paper and I said, can you write to me as many words as you can in a minute? And so I set the time and I just let the student go to work. And what I found is he had about 15 words and they were all sight words. They were all sight words. So to me, that was a really good sign that the student could spell these sight words because those are the ones that don't follow the English language phonetically. And then I did reading interest survey. So if you look at some of the questions, answer at least one of the following 2 questions. What do you like about reading? What don't you like? Do you have a favorite series? And I also had this one where I'd ask the student if they had read this genre and they would tell me examples or topics that they had read, if they read a specific book. And then this other one also, I expanded beyond the reading and also like what they like to do at home on their own time. Why do you think a reading interest survey would be important to have a student do?
I know my dyslexic son refused to read. So there was no practicing at home.
So the reading interest surveys really help the teacher know what the student likes. And so if we know what they like, we can direct them towards the right books that might interest them because we want to motivate them to read. We want them to want to read, not make it feel like a chore. And so this helps teachers know like what their attitudes are and how we can help motivate them. And so then what I have next is the blank running record. And so a running record allows you to see, this is where the fluency comes into place. You have the student select a text and then you make a copy of it. And then as the student reads it out loud for you, you mark off if they got the word correct, where they made the error, if they showed any signs of going back and correcting themselves, or if they maybe read ahead and were like, oh, okay, that doesn't make any sense. It's obviously going to be this other word. And so it allows you to also see where they are on their grade level, which was probably, this was the first one that I did with my student because I wanted to see if they were reading on their grade level. And so he was, and that was a really good indicator for me. His book was one of his independent reading books, and he was able to score a 98%, which showed me that he selected a good text for his reading level. Because we don't want them to be reading texts that are too challenging on their own because then it might discourage them to continue reading. And then I have a developmental spelling assessment. And so this one, again, I just recited to him the first sentences. I went down the list, and he would just have to write down the word jet. So for example, number 2 was ship. So I'd say ship. The ship sailed across the water. So the student would have to write down the word ship. And then I went back and I looked at his scores to see where he was lacking. And so there's a key to this that shows you if they need more help on blends or digraphs. And so my results were from this that the student had no problem spelling, which is great. And so where I did start to see some issues, and this happened really just by chance that I was just helping him with his homework that day, was that every week the teacher has the students write a summary of what they read the night before. And so I helped him along with this, and what I noticed as he was writing his summary, and I read some of his before, was that he was lacking a lot of information. He was lacking a lot of detail when it comes to his summary. And so I quickly went ahead and I did an intervention, and I was just like, okay, how does the story go? What is the structure of the story? So we have beginning, a middle, and an end. And so to just kind of remind the student of like what we're looking for in a summary, what it entails. And so after that, I did another mid-assessment. I looked at one of his reading summaries, and then I noticed that he was able to write chronologically what he had read, but it was still missing more details. And so then what I did is I did another intervention, and I reminded him when we're reading, we need to be looking for who, what, where, when, and why. And so I really wanted to get some details out of him. But even then, I was still struggling, and I was just like, what can I do to help him bring what he's reading onto paper? So the reading and writing processes go hand in hand, as you can probably tell. And so I came up with this bookmark tool. And so, as you can see in the picture, I have who, what, where, when, why, and how, and then I have these little rectangles, and these rectangles are actually post-it notes that you can just peel off and stick in the book, and they're transparent so that the student can like still read underneath it. And what I found is also during this time I was observing a fourth grade classroom, and the teacher was really focusing on teaching students how to highlight nonfiction texts and how to like gather the information that they need from those texts. And my student I was doing the case study on, this was his stories that he was reading were like Tintin and Diary of the Wimpy Kid, and I was just like, how can I bring those reading strategies into this fiction as opposed to nonfiction? You know, we don't really want our kids highlighting in books because they go back to the library when they're done. And so this is a good way, I felt, using the post-it notes that the student could just mark it in there, so when they have to come back and look at the summary, that they can just like skim through the book and they'll see the bright colors pop up in the page and say, okay, I marked this for a reason, so let's see what it says. And it's also a bookmark because a lot of times teachers will give this graphic organizer, but we do it at the very end, and students will have a hard time trying to find where they found this information in the story. And so I felt that the bookmark, along with the post-it notes, could help the child connect the two, so that at the end they could go back and reflect on the book and look to where they found all these answers. And what I found is at the end, when I went back to review it, I was able to gather so much more detail from him because he was able to go back to the book and say, oh, the main character was such and such, and I know this because it was all about him and he did all these other events, and it was just, I was able to generate so much more detail by having him go back that way. And so, yeah.
You have an example of something here on the right.
Oh, yes. So I have an example of a text that we would have, a nonfiction text that we would have students read. So you guys can take a couple minutes to read it, and then I'm going to ask you guys to answer who, what, where, when, and why. All right? Okay, I'll give you guys 1 minute to read it really fast. So who can answer the who in this text? Humans, yes. Who can answer the what? What is this all about? Global warming, right? The title indicates that. Who can tell us when? What is this happening? Right now, yes. Who can answer us where? Where is it happening? On the planet Earth. Why is it happening? Pollution, yes. And then how? Gases, right? And so we can gather all that from nonfiction text so much easily than we can from a story, because that stories become, they start to get more complex in the storyline. There'll be multiple meanings and so many characters, and it's hard for the students to try and find all that. So I found in my study, in my classroom, I will personally do this, is have students also practice these highlighting skills for all of the genres that they are exposed to. I'm just trying to get to the end. It's done. And so this is why teachers do so many assessments, both informal and formal.
A few minutes for questions.
It's okay. Yeah, he was open to it. He actually came to me because I asked several of the kids in our after school program if I could do a case study on one of them. And the first student I picked, he really needed the help, but he was very resistant. But then he actually came and volunteered himself. He's like, I need help with reading. He's like, I need help with writing my summaries. And I was like, okay, that's great that you understand that. So I was able to help him that way.